In mind the old medieval scrolls. Hear ye, hear ye. But Ambassador Einaudi is an educated and diplomat, visiting senior fellow at the Inter-American Dialogue in D.C., working on multilateral governance and conflict resolution. Retired from the Department of State in July 1997 after serving 8 years on the Secretary of State Policy Planning staff, 12 years as Director of Policy Planning for the Bureau of Inter-American Affairs, and 4 years as U.S. Ambassador to the Organization of American States. From 1995 to 1998, he was the U.S. Special Envoy in the peace talks that led to the comprehensive settlement of the centuries-old territorial boundary conflict between Ecuador and Peru. As ambassador to the OES, Dr. Einaudi developed initiatives to support democracy and increase trade. And in his quarter century with the State Department, he played a major role in policy articulation and participated in the consultations of almost every Latin American nation, Japan, most Western European nations, and NATO. Topics included the Panama Canal treaties, human rights, the Caribbean Basin Initiative, Granada, Central American and Haitian crises, and U.S. military actions and arms transfers. He is also the generator of the Einaudi Fellowship for Latin American Studies to encourage ICAR work in Latin America and the Caribbean. And our Janet Murdoch is the first fellow in that sense. So Ambassador Einaudi, welcome.
Thank you, Professor Warfield. One of the great advantages of reading an old bio is it reminds me of all kinds of things I thought I'd forgotten. You actually are more of a generator of the so-called Einaudi Fellowship than I am, because it was you and Chris and Janet, I suspect, and a few other people who came up with the idea, and then we were able to maybe do something about it. I am not 100% certain what the best use of our time today is. I sort of came up with this title, National Boundaries and Progress, Lessons from Latin America and the Caribbean, because boundaries and conflicts over them can be an obstacle to progress. They also can be created by progress. And their resolution, I think, can stimulate a lot of progress. And I've been struck by the importance of technology in changing the conditions that can lead to or even create tensions and conflicts. And the reason I asked that this map be put up, and it's interesting because it's missing the two basic features, two of the three basic features. Well, no, there's a lot of features here. Everybody who has any education about the Western Hemisphere's geography knows that, in effect, there is a fantastic spine of the Andes. Up north it becomes the Rockies, that runs through South America. And in this case, it helps, I think, to explain something very important to me about how things have developed and how technology has changed things. Back when the New World was being discovered and settled, the Pope was still an important figure, and he helped develop a so-called Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. And that line, although there are a lot of modern boundaries here, that line went roughly like this. And everything on this side was supposed to be Portuguese, and everything, say, from Brasilia west was supposed to be Spanish. And so one of the questions that one immediately asks is, how come Brazil has bled past that line in such a dramatic fashion? Well, I should have used a different verb, not bled, but floated. And taking advantage of one of the oldest doctrines actually in the determining of sovereignty and state control, uti possidetis, which is the Latin for where you possess. Portuguese, Brazilian explorers and settlers and just floated on boats up the Amazon until they came to, in most cases, the natural boundaries that were established by the end of the rivers who stopped floating. And the mountains were there. Now, in a funny way, Peru-Ecuador is the same story writ small. Because, again, in the old days when you floated, the Peruvians floated up and took possessions until the mountains, the Andes, stopped them. And in that situation, they were safe. The Ecuadorians were in no position to particularly object. There was a natural, the same geographic force, the Andes, which had blocked Peruvian northern floating, acted as a barrier to Ecuadorian coming down. And so, for a long time, nobody cared. And in fact, one of the interesting things about the boundaries that we see here is in most cases, they were out in the middle of nowhere, very far from settled areas. Therefore, literally, nobody cared. There was a State Department geographer who took a look at the mountain boundary between Peru and Ecuador around 1940. And he said, well, you know, it goes up there somewhere where no man has ever set foot. And it was that way for a long time, and it was fine. Now comes, however, the impact of a different kind of technology and change. And the basic technology here, I think, well, I didn't say broadly it's the aircraft, but really specifically it's the helicopter. And suddenly, using the helicopter, the Ecuadorians were in a position, some of them, to dream of undoing all that Peruvian floating and regaining control of territory. And suddenly, once you had the helicopter that enabled you to move into very difficult terrain without having to float, you not only could rebuild up high, but you were high. So you had the advantage over the people who were down below you. And that basic sort of military strategic thing was something that seriously and completely affected the Ecuador-Peru conflict. I'll come to that, but I want to continue with this sort of general introduction because there's a further change of technology that I want to mention, which is changing the way in which disputes are working in the world. And suddenly we can shift, or should shift, our attention from the land to the seas. And I downloaded last night, I'll just pass these around very quickly. One is a map of the world showing the various territorial claims from territorial sea to contiguous zones to exclusive economic zones as established under the law of the Sea Convention of the United Nations. Now, what is utterly misleading about this map is that it sort of pretends that these are boundaries out there and that everybody accepts them. Unfortunately, they're not. For one reason, the United States, in its headstrong manner, has refused to ratify the Law of the Sea Convention. It is true that Senator Kerry promised Hillary Clinton that ratification of the Law of the Sea would be at the top of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee agenda when they had the hearing to confirm Secretary of State Clinton earlier this year. But I've heard nothing since, and as you are probably almost as aware as I am, the United States has an appallingly bad record, which is astounding to me because we're a country that is built on and has in fact historically supported and built international law. But we have in recent years just been behaved like scoundrels. To magnify, since I was supposed to talk about Latin America and the Caribbean, here's a set of drawings of those lines in the Caribbean. And suddenly, looking at it, without even looking very closely, one realizes that one is dealing with a whole new world, and it's rendered even worse by the fact that the treaties needed to bring that world into practice and to avoid conflict are, for the most part, not yet negotiated and made more difficult by the failure of a country like the United States to ratify the convention. It doesn't help the United States, but it tends to hurt others. Now, the reason why technology is so important, of course, is that in the old days, just as you couldn't imagine what was up on top of the mountains, you get very far from shore, and other than having a claim for fishing rights, for example, you couldn't think of deep sea mining or deep sea oil drilling. Now, with its revolution of technology, all kinds of technologies, you really can do it. And one of the extraordinary things is that you have countries like Brazil, not just quote-unquote developing the way we like to talk about them, but Brazil's state oil company, Petrobras, is absolutely in the world lead in deep sea drilling technology. They have made some major finds, and probably in a few years we will see Brazil coming online as a very major oil producer, as well as leader in some of the alternative technologies. And that may be one of the reasons why the Brazilian Navy is currently developing a nuclear submarine, whose chief planners are talking about being able to protect themselves from maneuvers coming from the north. So one has to wonder about some of these things. So technology, as I've tried to say, is a source of sudden reversals in the way things work and changes, and one has to really be very much aware. And be aware also, I think, that conflict zones punish people who have the misfortune of living there. They punish them in part simply because central governments were afraid that they might get invaded will not build roads out your way because those roads might be used for the neighboring enemy to invade. Or if there have been conflicts, or even attempts to end conflicts or prevent conflicts, if mines have been sown, then you have people being killed and maimed, and agriculture rendered impossible, and all kinds of other problems. It is a very interesting fact that in trying to develop a solution to the Peru-Ecuador conflict, the strongest support came from the Peruvians and the Ecuadorians who were living on the border itself, and who felt themselves punished by the existence of the conflict. And there is data in a recent study that suggests it's now 10 years since the peace was established, and trade between Peru and Ecuador has multiplied 6 or 7 times in 10 years, which is, I think, in itself a fairly eloquent testimonial. Now, let me talk a moment about Peru and Ecuador, and then try to draw some lessons that actually I developed rules when I was acting as the U.S. Special Envoy, and in a funny way, I have to say nothing I will ever do or did before or will ever do again will come close to that achievement. Because what happened in effect was that when Ecuador and Peru went to war in December of 1994, the outside world didn't really figure it out for about a month. I mean, when I say they went to war, there were the initial skirmishes between patrols. By the time in February of 1995, it became possible to bring in a ceasefire. You had in a single valley, which really doesn't show, but it shows abnormally here because of the little curve in the boundary. There were 5,000 special forces, troops from the two countries, basically all the special troops that the two countries had. But this was up in 10,000 feet altitude, triple canopy jungle. One of the American Special Forces generals who had come out of Cambodia said that in terms of difficulty of terrain, the Cenepa, the name of this valley, was an 11 on a scale of 10. And it was really an extraordinary thing. What had happened was it was so close, so complicated to see that the two forces, the forces were intertwined. There were Peruvians behind Ecuadorians and Ecuadorians under Peruvians and all over the place. And one of the real challenges became to get them unentangled without real problems. So the basic outline is that 4 countries, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and the United States, came together, and each of them agreed to contribute 10 soldiers, 10 officers, to a military observation mission. The United States also, at first, contributed the helicopters needed for mobility up there. So the U.S. provided the logistical tail, if you will, of this military mission. 4 countries coming together to do something good is a nice thing. In this case, we were lucky because the 4 of us were legally guarantors of the peace treaty that had existed previously, guaranteeing that line between Ecuador and Peru. So in a sense, we were forced into acting without asking too many questions or having anybody raise 2 things. Now, each country had to nominate somebody to sort of be the lead person. The 3 Latin American countries all named their deputy foreign minister, who inevitably was a very busy person, which left me as the lowest ranking member of the lot, since I was only at that point deputy director of the policy planning staff. I had more time, I could devote more effort, and in effect, to a large extent, I sort of took over much of the negotiation, and in particular, much of the effort to gain the confidence of the two sides, because that was one of the things that was hardest to attain. Each felt that any proposal coming out from the other was guaranteed to be self-interested, bad for them, and in need of being opposed. It took 3 years for us to work out a negotiation a solution that would work. They were very hard years. There were times when, in fact, we all thought that things were not going to be able to continue. It's one of the ways that I learned that one of the maxims in diplomacy is to keep the ball in the air. We would never adjourn a negotiating meeting without a specific date certain for the next one, so that there could not be something just left in the air as being too difficult and too complicated to be dealt with. You knew that you had to take time. And we got something that I still believe, and I am hoping very much that with the Obama administration we may see a little bit more of this approach. We would meet, the four of us, the four guarantors, and we would meet to decide what we had to do next. And we all came with our ideas and our proposals, and we also knew what our governments would back and wouldn't. It's a very interesting problem that I had, was trying to keep the U.S. government engaged. The NSC under President Clinton was deathly afraid that someday it would hit the press that the U.S. had not only had some soldiers, but that one of them had gotten injured or killed in the Amazon jungle. What's the interest there? How could you explain that? So one of the most difficult processes I had, I said it lasted for 3 years, I had to do it in 90-day increments of authority because they didn't want to give any kind of indefinite authority for involvement and for keeping the military there. Okay, let me tell you, there's one basic outcome that made this thing possible. Substantively, procedurally, we did a lot of things, and I'll talk about those, what my operating principles were. But we had to transform a situation that was really a zero-sum game. Either Ecuador would get back some of the land that it had lost, specifically in the 41 conflict, or it would not. And if you defined it purely in those terms, it was impossible. There was no way to give Ecuador its dignity if the final decision had to be that that line was basically soundly drawn. And we are living in a world in which boundaries are not something that you play with very much. Too much of history has been shed over that. And there was one critical thing that happened during the fighting before the ceasefire. Not only had the Ecuadorians moved units into this area, which was well into Peru, but they had buried their soldiers at a spot there. I knew from the start that this was, in effect, a deal breaker, because there was no way that Peru was going to grant to Ecuador part of its sovereign territory. On the other hand, there was no way that Ecuador could agree to a deal where it would either abandon its soldiers or have to dig them up in some ignominious retreat. So that was a basic issue of let us say, of dignity, really, and it was all and dignity for the Ecuadorian military, whether you liked them or not. That you had to give them that respect. And I will say that one of the interesting underlying principles in any kind of conflict settlement, I think, is the need to give all sides respect and to understand what their interests are and try to work on those interests. But the other reason why we had to sort of try to change the thing was that, first of all, if it was evident that Ecuador was not going to get the land, then what was it going to get? One of my good friends out of this whole process was Paco Moncayo, an Ecuadorian general who then became a quite effective mayor of Quito. And his son quit the army. Military families, we've seen it, we see it here in the United States, successful fathers, sons who want to compete and stay with them, etc. The son was an officer and basically said to his father, well, but you sent us to die, and now you accept our not getting what you sent us for. How can we accept that? What the negotiation did was that it transformed the issue from one of only land and sovereignty, which is a very old concept. It's an important concept. Jesse Helms is now dead, but he held high the flag of American sovereignty for years. It was actually useful to have him around in one sense, because while he was supporting policies that were difficult to support on any other grounds, he was usually saying the United States would never tolerate X or Y because it would be an assault on its sovereignty. And so I could turn and I could say, well, see, that's why Peru will never accept X or Y, or Ecuador will never accept X or Y, or what have you. In any case, why did Ecuador want that land? Because they felt that they had to have access to the Amazon. And if you go back to colonial days, one of the expeditions that, quote unquote, discovered the Amazon through one of its tributaries started in Quito. And there are maps, you can find Ecuadorian maps, unfortunately, that show Ecuador's territory running all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, cutting Brazil in half, on the grounds of that feat of exploration. So what we worked on was a modern concept. Sometimes you can steal even from the pages of American imperialism. We had the Panama Canal as if sovereign. So we talked to the Peruvians about allowing the Ecuadorians access on a permanent basis to the Amazon as if they were sovereign. They're not. They won't be, but they can have access. In fact, they have ports on the Amazon, on the Peruvian Amazon today. So it was possible to reach an agreement. Now, and the agreement on the land, absolutely fascinating. In effect, the cemetery of the Ecuadorians. It's a small spot, 1 square kilometer, a tiny postage stamp in the unmarked jungle. In the agreement, that square kilometer became property of Ecuador. Property of Ecuador inside Peru. With the provision, Ecuador could, it was private property, but it could never sell it. It can never sell it. Conversely, Peru can never expropriate it. So it is in perpetuity for Ecuadorian use without sovereignty. I think the Ecuadorian military would not have accepted it without some formula like that. And conversely, I still get sworn at in Peru for having somehow not managed to support Peruvian sovereignty to the full. In managing the negotiation, in addition to doing what, in my slightly confused presentation, I'm afraid, I lost the argument that I thought the Obama administration might do that the US hasn't been doing recently. It's that the four guarantors, when we met to determine policy, we would go in there, each with our own positions. What we would come out with was usually a position that nobody had advocated before going in and listening and hammering out a joint position that we could support. That, I think, is the real meaning of multilateralism. It's not going in and saying, I'm leading this way, you all follow me. Yeah, no, thank you. It won't work that way. Nobody's going to want to do it. And particularly after the record that in spite of our power, et cetera, we've managed to compile recently. I had 5 rules. The first was to maintain unity. And if you're representing the United States, you must ensure that you are seen as representing the United States. When Secretary of State asked me to take on the special envoy job, the first thing I did was to say, well, you mind, I will do this, but my first call is going to be to General Barry McCaffrey, who's the commander of U.S. Southern Command, because I am going to need his support, and ultimately I got it in spades. I went to negotiations in a United States military aircraft, and I had a colonel carrying my bags, and usually I had better communications than the U.S. Embassy did. The net result was nobody there could say, well, Einaudi, he just represents those striped pants types in the State Department. Sure, the Defense Department's not going to go along, etc. And it is an extraordinary business in the United States to keep the government and all the different parts of the different agencies on the same page. And if you don't do it, the outsiders, the foreigners, will be convinced that you in fact don't represent anybody other than your particular agency, or maybe even just a fraction of it. My second, so I spent, just to finish the unity, maintain unity, at the level of the US government, I spent an enormous amount of time having interagency meetings and getting everybody on board. Not easy always, because the intelligence community with special ties into various militaries and others was very skeptical that we could ever get anything solved. So it was really necessary to, and then you had, as I said, the White House interest in not having military guys exposed to danger or anything like that. The other kind of unity we had to do, of course, was to maintain unity among the 4 guarantors, because the 2 sides were constantly coming to one or the other to try to get us to go on their side or to take that position. So we had to maintain unity so that at the end there was no choice but to go along. And the signing ceremony was a very interesting signing ceremony, because we had, in addition to the presidents of all the South American countries, we had the King and Queen of Spain and the number 3 ranking cardinal from the Vatican in a munificent red robe and cross to symbolize the support of the international community. that this was a good thing, and really that there wasn't any alternative to it. You had to go along. Second rule, it's so obvious that, you wonder that I had to do it, but it's to ensure military support, and which meant I had to spend an enormous amount of time with the Peruvian military and with the Ecuadorian military, trying to figure out where they were, what their interests were, how we could get them involved. In fact, one of the interesting and innovative things that we did, since they did not like each other and did not trust each other, and had reasons for not always trusting us, after we separated the contending forces and created what was in effect a demilitarized zone, which the ultimate solution turned into a park. We turned it into a binational park, which is divided by the boundary, but equal amounts of territory on each side, and it's open to the indigenous populations, and knock on wood, let's hope that it works ultimately as well as the trade has worked. But I said, look, we've got a demilitarized zone. We now have these 40 MOMAT officers, US, Argentine, Brazilian, Chilean here. We ought to have Peruvians and Ecuadorians supervising the zone together with our people, so that their soldiers can spy and report that we're being honest and that things really are as is being said. And we did integrate the local disputants into the observation force. Small footnote, if I'm allowed to say it, because I think it's the only case I know of where two poor countries, Peru is on the rich side in many ways, Ecuador is a poor country in terms of size and ease of resources and everything else. Peru and Ecuador paid for MOMAT. i.e., I still have an assistant who's now gone off. He's retired in Arizona. Hey, the biggest moment of his life was he was running around the embassy in Quito holding a check for more than $1 million from the government of Ecuador to pay the exorbitant costs of the Pentagon to station 10 soldiers on the border there. Which tells you that if you listen, if you work, you can achieve a great deal and you don't have to browbeat people. Third rule, which is one of the reasons why this also works. The parties must lead. You may think, as the outside negotiator, that you know where they want to go. You may even think you know where they have to go. But unless they're willing to do it, it's no go. You've got to then wait and approach from another way. It's one of the reasons why we had some of the delays we had. But the parties must lead. Now, in getting people to lead, to accept that they must do things, my fourth rule, and again, these last years have been very hard psychologically on me, and I think on a lot of us as Americans. My fourth rule was use the law. We are at a moment in our political history, maybe Obama will say that, reconstruct, but we basically have stopped believing in the law. I mean, you go into Iraq against the will of the Security Council. That is the only legitimizing use of force against a sovereign state that we have in the world. The law may not work, it may not always be it, but use the law. The law is fundamental. It's what distinguishes us from animals. And what's interesting is we had a very long negotiation just to put together the military observers before we could ever even talk to the Peruvians and Ecuadorians, who are having a hell of a time and all kinds of problems in the actual zone. We had to negotiate terms of reference. Who was going to command the force? What were the Pentagon, scared stiff at going into the Amazon jungle where there would be wild Indians and God knows what? Sometimes it sounded as though they wanted tactical nuclear weapons, just in case. Well, you have to work all these things through, and then you, in effect, you have a law. You have a frame of reference. This is what you have to do. And you apply this all the way to fifth rule. It's very simple. And again, this has been psychologically a rough period for us, for the world. Keep sights high. You know, it's amazing how depressed you can get when you're stuck in the mud. If there is no vision of utopia, of a better world out there for you, if you can finally slog through and get an agreement. So at all times, I push these people, my Americans and our colleagues, to stay united, to make sure that we had the military supporting us, not going behind our back, and that we allowed the parties to lead, that what we did was ourselves lawful, and that we used their desire to be lawful in our favor and in the favor of a settlement. And finally, that you keep sights high. Keeping sights high is a difficult thing sometimes. It can lead, in this case, I think it led to some abuse, in the sense that people perhaps promised more assistance, economic assistance, than was ultimately delivered. Although I think, on the whole, this was done more by local people, the local parties of peace, if you will, who wanted the peace badly and went around saying, you know, you support this and the Americans will provide the sky. But keep sights high in the sense that, you know, peace can bring integration, can bring development. Failure to make peace can bring isolation, and having to be stuck down in the mud the entire time. Let me end by saying a quick word about the park. This is an area, the American geographer who went there for the State Department, did the study for the State Department back in the 40s, referred to this conflict area as, quote, in the clouds where no man had trodden, unquote. Again, there were certain small rules that led to the final solution. One was recognizing Tiwinsa, the burial place of the Ecuadorians. That's inside the park. And you build the park because you do it in a way that's respectful of sovereignty and symbolizes the future. Somehow, even if you're slogging in the mud, you want to be able to think that there can be a park, that there can be development, that there can be something. Both parties had to contribute. And that's why, although the Ecuadorian, the zone had poured over into Peru, we insisted that there also had to be an equal amount of territory on the Ecuadorian side of the line involved. So what you had were two parks, really, not one. The Spanish word is colindantes. They were abutted each other. Each was to be administered by national authorities under their respective national laws. So we weren't trying to tromp on Ecuador or on Peru. On the other hand, there was a coordinating committee under rotating chairmanship between the two countries. Local Indian communities and this was one of the my interesting sensitizations, were guaranteed free transit. I met with some of the Shuar Indians, and even in this talk, I have several times talked about these boundaries where there are no people. Well, there were people, and then but the density is low. And the Shuar leader drew himself up and said, what makes you apply your urban standards to the geography and the land that we need to fish and live on? I must say I learned a lot too. Security, because after all, once again, these have got to be real solutions that can be lived on. So they both agreed to create a park police only to provide security with no military posts. No new military posts, but each was allowed one existing post with a 50-man limit nearby. So that ultimately, I think this part of it, the park, is really a management of symbols. It wasn't real. I still don't know, I apologize, I should know, whether a proper road has been built in to have access to this great imaginary park. But it's the management of the symbols is enough to give people some confidence and some hope, and where the real benefits have come have been that neither side has had to spend, both of them have cut their military expenditures in half since then. You've had the great increase in trade. You are beginning to move use of the Amazon for the Ecuadorians. And above all, people aren't dying. People haven't died. And today the peace is more supported there now than it was actually even when it was made, when it was reached. I'll end by going back to what isn't one of my 5 rules, but is one of the built-in things. I said respect. Respect means understanding the dignity of all the players and granting them their dignity and having the patience to work until you found something that preserves the interests of all sides. And that's another of my complaints in recent years. State Department efficiency reports are written in terms of advancing U.S. interests without much realization of the fact that it takes 2 to tango. That if the other guy doesn't get anything out of it, there is no reason why he should abide by it and stay with you. In other words, we've got to learn to define interests in such a way that others can gain too. Thanks.
Thank you, Augustine. I actually think we're small enough as an audience that we take questions right from where you are right now. You don't need to moderate.
Sure. You know what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit down because I'm getting old enough that my legs don't hold me very well.
Absolutely.
So I will simply move over here and sit down.
Rich.
Well, that was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. I just noticed one thing about your
Old friends are useful.
Your rules.
Sorry.
It's like we're continuing a conversation
I gather that.
begun 50 years ago. That you have 6 rules, counting the respect rule, but there's also a 7th in there, which I noticed its absence because I used to talk to John Burton about his rules, and John had a lot more rules than you do about conducting conflict resolution workshops and so on. And at a certain point I would ask John, but where did you get the idea for this solution, or where did you or somebody get the idea for this solution, which is, to use the cliche, outside the box, which kind of rejects what everybody starts out by thinking are the givens, and ends up with something as imaginative as the imaginary park, or the two militaries in the same observation team and that sort of thing. There's the seventh rule seems to me has to do with, and you're I think too modest, which I think Burton was too actually, to kind of say this idea occurred to me as a way of a creative way of solving this problem that seemed insoluble, or if not to me, to somebody else. So I just wondered if you would say something about where you think these ideas come from. What's the source of creativity in the process?
No, that's a very good observation. They came from what makes me most proud about the process, and what I tried to describe it as the essence of multilateralism in the few words.
The give and take of
the give and take of. I'm the first one that defined the area that ultimately was given to Tuwinsa, turned into Tuwinsa, the square kilometer within the thing, by saying that in a meeting in Buenos Aires, we rotated among the capitals to meet, and that it was a damn shame that the deal breaker was just a square kilometer inside, no more than that. But the person who actually understood that there was a legal basis for defining this very carefully in such a way that it could be included into things that could meet both sides' requirements. That wasn't even one of the four guarantors. That was one of it was a Peruvian. It was but one of the members of the parties. So that how that particular thing emerged was precisely from the open debates and willingness to listen and respect each other among the guarantors, and then what you picked up on the military side, but this was civilian, the willingness to include into that the parties. And that's how ultimately we managed to solve it. Now, some of those points I have never written because we're all still alive, and I think there are people who made contributions who to this day, if it were to be known how they made them, it would detract. I mean, ultimately, sort of all this participatory, egalitarian, high-minded nonsense that I've fed you, it is the truth, but it was never presented that way. Politically, it couldn't be. We couldn't say, we sat down, we hammered all this out, etc. What actually happened formally is a fascinating thing. We came to understand what this solution would look like, which included treaties on the navigation. It included the stuff on the park. It included putting in the line properly, etc. And on the line, we even had a supreme decision of a panel of judges chaired by the Chief Justice of the Brazilian Supreme Court. So we really, this was organized, okay? But the form of this is fascinating. The world is littered with broken treaties, with peace agreements that have been orphaned, or what have you. So you know that when you're actually putting something together like this, you've got to get everything to it, and instead of making it seem like a democratic thing, you almost have to make it look like a mandate from God. That it's just, it's so, you know, high and mighty that it's just, that's it. Act of God. So the act of God in this case took 2 steps. Actually 3. Because first the proposal. The proposal was to tell the 2 countries, ostensibly without their having a clue as to what the solution was ultimately going to be, although we've been debating it, etc. They knew, but public opinion didn't, that we were at a point where a solution had to be made. And we, the 4 guarantors, were willing to have our presidents issue a joint finding. Bill Clinton, Fernando Enrique Cardoso, Saul Menem, the Chilean Frey, they would jointly issue, and all of them would sign it, a solution. But they would do it only after the 2 countries' Congresses had each ratified the solution without knowing what was going to be in it. I mean, it really, it was, but people were tired. I remember, it's interesting, a Peruvian presidential candidate called me, a very good friend of mine, called me and said, Luigi, do you have some sneaky thing in here that is going to destroy us? Or should I support this mad thing in the Congress? And I said, it's perfectly consistent with Peruvian sovereignty. I didn't tell her that you're going to give that burial ground to the Ecuadorians in perpetuity, even though it's still yours, that we found a legal way to do that. I didn't tell her that. She became known as Miss Tiwinza in Peruvian politics and may have lost the presidential election in part over that. She lost it worse over the fact that her father made some stupid comments about Indians being stupid, which you know, he should have been thrown out, but that's all right. And so the ultimate solution, you see it under the names of the presidents of the 4 guarantors as the finding, and that's where you go back, and that's where the park is defined, and that's where the boundary, everything is all worked out in all detail. But it was, as I say, it was handed down, not by the negotiators, not with the Peruvians and the Ecuadorians saying this is what we agreed to or anything. We accept it because, well, it's gotten to that point, you know. And when you think that they were, both sides had engaged in general mobilization, and that, you know, ultimately the Ecuadorian military had to realize that they didn't stand a chance. And if things kept going. And not only that, that even if they didn't lose, they were condemning themselves and their country to being ruled by the bayonet forever, with them holding the bayonets, because there wouldn't have been the money to do even the pretense of a social and economic development plan. So when you move them around so that they understand that they've got no choice but to make peace, then you can build. But it's an extraordinary business of building, and it's an extraordinary business of symbolism, of managing symbols correctly, so that all sides can come out concluding that they, at least that their dignity has been respected, and maybe some more interest gained.
Nancy.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm fascinated by this idea that you put something in front of 2 Congresses that didn't say anything that they approved. And how did you phrase that? I mean, what did the legislation look like? I'm trying to picture that.
That we accept it. I don't have a piece of paper with me, and it has that of all pieces I've not looked at since, but essentially that you know, be it enacted that the finding to be issued by the presidents of the United States, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. Yes, is coming last if you're doing it in English by alphabet. Is hereby accepted as binding. Period.
Wow.
Period. I have to say that I'm not enough of an authoritarian to have ever dreamed that was possible to do. And so that is not something that I thought of, I'm afraid. But it worked. It worked. And ultimately, I mean, the real test is the test that the Peruvian politician asked me before she authorized her party to vote. You know, is this going to destroy me or not? And I said, no, well, I don't think it will. Well, maybe. Maybe it did or didn't. But I think basically it didn't. I think this thing has held now for more than 10 years. And that's a pretty good sign. And nobody's buying jets. The Brazilian Air Force had succeeded in getting the government to say, we're going to buy whatever it was, 150 modern jets. We're a big country, manifest destiny and all the rest. And Fernando Henrique Cardoso was able to delay it, and Lula was able to cancel it. Because this settlement made it clear that there was no real need.
Ambassador, these 5 or 6 rules seem generalizable to many kinds of conflicts. What can you say is unique, perhaps as a rule or a finding, with respect to border conflicts?
Well, you know, anything involving sovereignty, and that's what border stuff is vitamins for bad politicians. I mean, it's so easy to go out there and scream and raise a fuss and all the rest. I think that these things, I think you've got to get, I mean, I don't know. The United States is a very privileged country. We, in effect, I mean, I don't know, some of you will outthink and outknow me, but it seems to me that part of the shock of September 11 was because we had never been attacked on our own territory. I mean, I suppose when it goes back far enough, one can invent something or find some fascinating historical things, but in sort of in the modern period. So our military does not have, powerful as it is, and I think it's mildly obscene, actually, that our country has found ways to fund all kinds of things through the military and not through civilians. I mean, even for those who are interested in foreign policy and in U.S.-Latin American relations, even the Office of American Republic's Affairs, headed by Nelson Rockefeller in 1940, was funded by the Defense Department, through the Defense Department. But even living in that situation, our military is, we don't see a soldier and think of the flag and of the sacred soil of the country. If you're in Peru or Ecuador with these histories, that's part of the thing. And that's why ensure military support is such an important rule. Because if you're dealing with the border, they're the people who have to defend it. When I was working I turned the military in Guatemala into my major supporters on recognizing the independence and independent existence of Belize. Why? Because the Constitution of Guatemala said that Belize didn't exist and it was all Guatemala. All right. Now put yourself in their position. You're the military and you're supposed to be defending Guatemalan territory, and you can't even go into Belize. You're being asked to do something that you can't do. You're being turned into an incompetent fool on the face of it. So you have to, I found in dealing with the border area there, which fortunately now both countries have submitted to the World Court. But in my day, I did handle some direct negotiations, and then built in effect a buffer zone by putting an OAS office, a tiny little OAS office, right on the main road where the border checkpoint was. So the people on both sides, and we're dealing after all with people on the one side and the other, they all speak Mayan, Quiche, or God knows what, but their official languages are English and Spanish, and the laws are as different as you know, the U.S. and Mexico. So we just built this little buffer and put in a somebody who could be an ICAR graduate. I mean, a conflict person who, people who have worked, there's been more than one, in conflict resolution and listening to local people, getting them in between. But if you don't have the support of the military in that kind of situation, where the boundary is involved, where sort of the definition of, you know, that's why some people get very upset. There is still, for example, one of the disputes that's not been settled in spite of the court, there's an International Court of Justice decision on the border between El Salvador and Honduras. And ironically, that land border has been totally demarcated now, but by me. That is to say, by me as the OAS, having received the two foreign ministers, and they said, we can't get this thing done. We'll trust you. Do you have somebody who will apply the law and the cartography in a way that will not unnaturally divide our peoples? And I had, as it turns out, well, I didn't have him, but I knew where to find him, an American cartographer married to a Chilean, who at that point, of course, given the way the U.S. works, was off working on Afghanistan. We didn't know anything about it. And we were able to get him assigned to the El Salvador-Honduras border. And in 6 months, we got everything solved. There were some hurts, but the hurts were divided. And we got the World Court decision implemented. And after I was out of office at the OAS, the government of Honduras paid my way back down to be present when the last monument border marker was put in. It was one of, you know, again, very nice, not as, because people didn't die the way they did between Peru and Ecuador. All right, but the border demarcation isn't just the land border. They have got, there is the Gulf of Fonseca, which also involves Nicaragua. And depending on which rock, it's really, you choose as your baseline, you change the results completely. Right now you've got Venezuela is going crazy with climate change because there's a small island that is part of their baseline geographically, which is going underwater. And the day that it doesn't come back up out of water, Venezuela is going to have to change a lot of things, or it's going to have to intimidate a lot of small neighbors or something. But there, unless a rock, who's going to be on that rock? If it's underground, military guys. They're going to go offshore in a little boat and watch until it comes up, then they'll come back out and they'll prove it's still there and it's our baseline and it's our land and it's our rock. And this is happening all over the world. So you've got to educate the military. You've also got to bring them and keep them under civilian control. That's That's another issue, but I've never had a military man disobey an order. I've never, you know, they're not built that way. They'll go and they'll do horrible things, and our country is suffering from what Abu Ghraib has done to us to take it down to that level, just as in an earlier age we suffered from what Lieutenant Calley did. But I would say that Lyndon Johnson in the Calley case and George Bush in the Abu Ghraib case, unfortunately, deserve some of the responsibility for what happened. If you are ordering people, or if you're failing to order people, and in our system it's the civilian responsibility, and there's just simply no two ways about it. But that's, sorry, it's an indirect, wandering answer, but on things that have to be talked about, and it's another reason why I like our current president, he talks. Reasons.
Chris?
Yes, sir.
This is a very unfair question, but I'm going to ask you anyway. We've just been asked by some people who have been involved in a border dispute, which has actually led to a shooting war, if we could give them some ideas about establishing some kind of a peace zone along the border which is in dispute. It's somewhat complicated by the fact that the actual border which is in dispute is supposed to, well, seen by one side is an administrative border within their sovereign territory.
Mm-hmm.
Seen by the other side, it's the border of an oppressed people who are struggling to establish their own sovereignty. Both of them seem, however, to want to have some kind of a buffer zone so that the shooting doesn't start up again. Do you have any advice as to how one might structure such a peace?
No, but Richard Rubenstein's question becomes relevant here. A friend of mine is dean at the University of Georgia, and he was commenting, he's more or less my generation, our generation. He was talking about sabbaticals. And in our day, if you had a sabbatical, you spent your time trying to figure out how you could con the Ford Foundation or Rockefeller or somebody else into funding your 6 months of field work somewhere. And my friend says that the junior faculty don't want to travel, don't want to go and get themselves, that they want extra time to sit by their computer, to manipulate data. Frankly, nothing could be more terrifying to me. And you know, my answer in terms of advice for that group is that you need to find a couple of people who know all the things that we have seemed to have taken out of our learning modules. Maybe you haven't, I hope. They have to do with culture, history, language, all of those particular things that give people idiosyncrasies, that make them different from each other, and which you must respect if you're going to respect people. I mean, I once actually, this will horrify you, it still pricks the small hair at the back of my neck when I think about it. I once, in my role as an international public servant when I was Assistant Secretary General of the OAS, made some comments opening a summit preparatory meeting where I talked about the importance of strengthening democracy in ways that were fully respectful of the idiosyncrasies, that's the word I used, of all of our peoples. The U.S. delegation took me aside and took me out to the woodshed. If you respect other people's idiosyncrasies, you have opened a door for every dictator in the world to drive through. We must have the same rules for everybody. Well, if you've got an administrative line on one side, a living zone for a semi-oppressed people on the other, and this and that, that's when you need the process of engagement and discussion that will lead to Rubenstein's seventh rule, to somebody coming up with a formula that is, between Belize and Guatemala, what we finally want, since we were dealing with a sort of similar thing, there's a boundary of what used to be British Honduras, which the Guatemalans don't recognize. We put in an office and sort of created an area there after tons of discussion. The word for it is adjacency zone. It has no meaning to anybody except it's what the people involved were willing to live with. And I think that's what has to be done in this kind. I don't know what the situation is, obviously, but I mean, as a piece of general advice, it seems to me that if you sort of think in terms of the kinds of arguments that I've been making, that you've got to create as broad a coalition of people to support the effort. You've got to include in that coalition whoever the security forces are, formal and informal. You've got to get locals to be willing to take the lead, except where they won't, but you've worked it out with them, as was this case of the act of God pronouncement at the end that I described. And probably tie it, if it's at all possible, to some event that is conceivable, it's going to be held in the future, that might reduce isolation and increase, bring benefits to the peoples on both sides of it. I mean, something like, that's what I've been trying to build here.
Okay, thank you.
Ambassador, thank you so much.
Well, thank you all very much.